Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 53 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about an exchange I had in the comments to a video we uploaded several weeks ago, episode 46. It was an episode with Stephen Halbrook where we discussed his book, America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. And from that episode, I created some short clips. And one of the short clips was about the arbitrary definition of assault weapons, or so-called assault weapons. And I received some kind of nasty feedback to that short, and I got into a bit of an exchange in the comments about that video, and I wanted to share that exchange with you because I thought it might be interesting to you, and I wanted to get your feedback to see if you had anything you think I missed in this exchange. Of course, a lot of the commentary I've heard before, it's pretty typical anti-gunner, gun control commentary. Nothing that, of course, that hasn't been said many times and, of course, rebutted and refuted many times. Nevertheless, it's something that we hear about, and I think that it's good to hear the counter arguments so that when you do hear these sorts of things in conversation, you're well equipped to address these issues. So, first of all, the so-called arbitrary definition of assault weapons. This assault weapons phrase was a phrase created out of thin air by the gun control group, the Violence Policy Center, back in the 1980s. I believe it was 1989. And it was with the express intent of confusing the general public, because the general public often has no idea how firearms actually function. And it was a term or a phrase that would easily confuse the general public about the distinction between arms that are commonly possessed by law-abiding citizens and arms that are typically used by the military. And of course, the firearm that they're primarily targeting with this phrase is the AR-15, which is a semi-automatic rifle that fires one shot with each press of the trigger, with each function of the trigger. Unlike an automatic firearm or a machine gun that can fire multiple rounds with a single function or operation of the trigger. So it's a phrase that they developed to confuse the public, to advance their gun control agenda. Nevertheless, that is sometimes a controversial view, especially to people who want to restrict our right to self-defense and our right to keep and bear arms, our individual liberty. And this exchange highlights some of the arguments that you'll hear. So I want to get into this exchange with you a little bit here. And I'll link to both to the full episode 46 with Stephen Halbrook and to this short clip from the video where you can find the original commentary. But the commenter says in the first response, their first response to the video, to the short, 2022, 695 mass shootings, 762 dead, 2,902 injured. American brain rot goes hard. Of course, they don't cite where they get those statistics. I think that they are completely arbitrary and unreliable statistics. Nevertheless, I replied, I said, I have yet to hear a proposal from gun control proponents that would change anything except to make innocent people more vulnerable. And of course, I didn't know if I would ever hear back from the person, but I did. And this person goes by Cadigan1, says, I have one, no guns. Works for all other Western nations. My country, for instance, gun control is so strenuous that you need to wait 5 years for background checks. Then you need to participate in the gun range for 10 years just to own a pistol at home as a hobby. You know what our worst school attack was? 4 dead, because the assailant only had a sword. So I respond, if a would-be murderer isn't going to comply with a law against murder, why in the world would he comply with a law prohibiting him from possessing a gun? Moreover, since there are plenty of guns around the world, the notion that a would-be murderer would be unable to acquire an illegal gun on the black market is absurd. What gun control laws do, then, is simply prevent innocent people from defending themselves against violent criminals. And Cadigan1 comes back and responds, you're implying that it is the populace responsibility to defend themselves instead of the government. Secondly, implying making guns accessible doesn't decrease gun violence when that is 100% true in every country that banned guns. 100% true. We're going to get to that in a minute. Thirdly, guns massively increase suicide rates, providing the simplest methods of suicide. A sane person with empathy would look at any of these reasons and think, maybe I can forego owning a gun if it saves lives. But no, just ignore extensive research done and historical precedents, because guns are fun enough to justify death. So far we have brain rot, we lack sanity and empathy. You can see the trend here. And the commenter says 100% true that gun violence decreases in countries that have banned guns. Of course, this is not true, and I will actually cite my sources, unlike this commenter. And I go on here in the comments and I say, I am, in fact, saying that it is the individual responsibility of each person to defend themselves, not the government. The United States Supreme Court has explicitly said that law enforcement have no duty to protect you or protect an individual. To your second point, it is not 100% true that decreasing access to guns reduces violence. This is not supported by the evidence at all. The exact opposite is true. One thing gun control advocates never mention is that every single time guns are banned, either all guns or handguns, homicide/murder rates rise. This is a remarkable fact. One would think that just due to random chance, 1 or 2 countries would have a drop in homicides after banning guns. Furthermore, a holistic view of the data show that it's not true that there's an association between more guns and more gun deaths. In fact, higher gun ownership rates are associated with lower homicide rates. Finally, the data show a positive association between death rates and the number of gun control laws. With respect to suicides, if you look at Australia as an example, firearm homicides and suicides were falling from the mid-1980s onwards. So you could pick out any subsequent year, and the average firearm homicide and suicide rates after that year would be down compared to the average before it. The question is whether the rate of decline changed after the gun buyback law went into effect. But the decline in firearm homicides and suicides actually slowed down after the buyback. Australia's buyback resulted in almost 1 million guns being handed in and destroyed. But after that, private gun ownership once again steadily increased and now exceeds what it was before the buyback. In fact, since 1997, gun ownership in Australia grew over 3 times faster than the population, from 2.5 million to 5.8 million guns. Gun control advocates should have predicted a sudden drop in firearm homicides and suicides after the buyback, and then an increase as the gun ownership rate increased again, but that did not happen. Of course, this is a very complicated topic, and we obviously disagree about the data, but neither one of us wants people to die, and to suggest that I am not sane and lack empathy is not productive. Although it is typical for gun control advocates to resort to personal attacks rather than real arguments. I think that gun ownership actually leads to less crime, and this is supported by lots of data. Over 90% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. I also think that gun ownership helps protect the most vulnerable. I helped train 1,500 women for free over the weekend in the second most violent city in America so that they wouldn't be defenseless against attack when law enforcement are minutes away and have no legal duty to protect them. I do not ignore history, data, or reality. You and I want the same outcome, less death. We just disagree about how to get there. The commenter, Cadigan1, responds once again. He says, heavily regulated gun ownership, even scaling it back to only hunting permits, would equal less gun ownership, which would equal less gun violence. And I'm going to pause here just a moment, and I'll come back to this comment. This person keeps coming back to gun violence, gun violence, gun violence. When I recast the argument in terms of gun ownership versus homicide or murder rates, we're talking about the overall death rate, not crimes committed with guns, because that ignores the real problem, the problem that we're trying to solve, which is less death. And this fixation, this monomaniacal fixation on guns, is the entire point of what we started the discussion with the assault weapon, the demonization of guns themselves, these tools that many people use millions of times a year in defensive gun uses for completely lawful purposes. So it's consistent. This fixation on guns just keeps coming to the forefront. Cadigan 1 goes on, the difference between a knife assault in a school against a gun assault is night and day. I also don't know in what world mass ownership of weapons and carry permits would make society safer, since most crimes are impulsive. And yes, it's the government's job to structure their society to be safer. Of course, I understand the U.S., which to this day engage in slavery and have legalized work camps, wouldn't trust their government, especially considering how extensively corrupt your politics are. I'll pause again here. I agree, our politics are extensively corrupt, and I respond to the bit about slavery and work camps in my follow-up comment. But it's hard to see where this argument is going. But I'll continue. But many European countries have social programs that prove much more effective at lowering crime rate instead of relying on vigilante behavior. Or do I need to remind you of what happens when Americans take justice into their own hands? In that case, just look at how POC are treated and were treated when they were often wrongly accused. So, and I'll do another aside here. We obviously disagree on who is responsible for protecting who. I think that self-protection is a personal responsibility. I don't think that anybody else has a duty to protect me, no matter who they are employed by, whether it's the government or some contractor. They have no obligation to risk their life for my benefit. My life is my responsibility and mine alone. And that's a fundamental difference in our worldview. But here's my response. I say, your assertion that scaling it back to only hunting permits would equal less gun ownership, which would equal less gun violence, is unsupported by the available data. If there is any correlation at all, there is a slight inverse relationship between gun ownership and violent crime. You shouldn't look at gun crime, which is nonsensical because guns don't commit crimes. People commit crimes. When we look at the overall violent crime rates and homicide rates, there appears to be an inverse correlation between gun ownership and violent crime. If you care to review the actual data, it is available here, and I'll link to the link that I linked to in the show notes. As for your comments about slavery and labor camps, I'm not sure what you are referring to. I have heard reports of those things in China with the Uyghur population and in North Korea. Maybe it's coincidence, but those subjugated populations are also subject to strict gun control. If, on the other hand, you are referring to general taxation, then yes, the United States does have taxation, much like Europe. Also, most examples of gun control in America have their origins in racism. Vigilante justice can be cruel and unjust, but by far, the greatest atrocities in this world have been committed by government against unarmed and vulnerable populations. So I will, like I said, I'll link to episode 46 with Stephen Halbrook, as well as the short where this exchange took place in the comments. But I wanted to share this with you because I think it's enlightening, it's insightful, maybe it's useful to you in some way in terms of the sorts of arguments that you're likely to encounter about not only gun rights or the right to keep and bear arms, but individual rights in general. So often arguments against individual liberty are cast in these sort of terms, like you need less freedom for the greater good. And of course, I think that less freedom is a disservice, that it's actually creates far less benefit, far less prosperity, far less voluntary cooperation than individual liberty, than freedom. But of course, all these figures that Cadogan 1 states as absolute fact and 100% true are completely unsupported by the data. And of course, Cadogan 1 leaves no reference whatsoever. I'll just point out once again here, John Lott, who I've mentioned quite a few times on the show previously, and I mentioned this earlier in this discussion. He says, if banning guns was the solution, why is it that every place in the world where all guns or all handguns were banned, that murder rates rose? Often by a lot. You can't name one where they fell. Simple reason. More law-abiding people, not criminals, are disarmed. And of course, he means by gun control. And he goes on, he says, this simple point applies to other gun control laws where they primarily disarm the most law-abiding people. And one thing that's interesting to point out here too, I don't have the statistic at my fingertips, but I'll link to it in the show notes if I can find it. is that there was a study conducted, and this has been done in various ways, but the result is largely consistent. And what the studies find is that law enforcement are significantly more law-abiding than the general public. But people who exercise their right to keep and bear arms and who get a permit, even without training, just get a permit, are far more law-abiding than law enforcement, significantly more law-abiding. I believe it was in the range of 8 to 12 times more law-abiding than law enforcement. And all these gun control laws do is serve to disarm that population of people, the most law-abiding population, and make them easier targets for crime. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that exchange. I'd certainly like to hear your feedback in the comments. What did I miss? What else could I have said? Am I wrong? What do you think? And am I right? Where do you think I was right? Where do you think I was wrong? And I'd be happy to hear your feedback. Of course, I'll link to a lot of the sources I have here in the show notes. I'll also link to the book by John Lott, More Guns, Less Crime, as well as the book by Stephen Halbrook, America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. I'd also I'll link to this as well. Stephen Halbrook wrote another book that's related to this discussion called Gun Control in the Third Reich. And that book is about the strategy of disarming the population before turning them into victims, which has, of course, been the strategy of most tyrannical regimes. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.